helping students and healthcare professionals not just survive, but thrive with a purpose. This is the CMDA Student Pulse podcast with your host, Bill Reichart, National Director of CMDA Campus Ministries.
Well, welcome to another episode of CMDA's Student Pulse podcast. I'm excited to have Dr. Ingrid Skop here from San Antonio, Texas with me. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me just give our listeners and viewers just a quick bio. You are an OB/GYN out of San Antonio, Texas. You've been practicing for about 30 plus years, but even currently you joined the Charlotte Lozier Institute, where you are the Senior Fellow and Director of Medical Affairs. And you are using your experience as an OB/GYN to support research and policies that respect the dignity of every human life. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But Ingrid, I just wanted to kind of walk through a little bit of your story before we kind of get started on talking about some of these issues about life and and personhood and others. But why did you feel called to be an OB/GYN? What called you into that particular specialty?
I think it is true that I am really called to be an OB/GYN. I feel passionate about the issue. I grew up in a pro-life family, the oldest of 6 children. My father was a pediatrician, so I just loved medicine and loved babies from a very early age. When I went to medical school and saw the first baby delivered, I said, this is it. This is what I've got to do. And I have never regretted it. It's hard, but it's so rewarding.
Has it gotten harder to be a person of faith, a Christian in that specialty?
It has gotten harder, but I think all of us, when we look around, it's just harder to be a Christian in general, anywhere, no matter what your profession today.
Yeah, no,
But the good news is that if you are willing to let your light shine, you really can make an impact.
Yeah. Well, you are letting your light shine and making an impact through the opportunities to talk into, I guess, public policy and other research. And tell us a little bit about the Charlotte Lozier Institute. You've been doing that now for just a little under a year, I think, in your current role. Perhaps you were involved with them prior to that. But what exactly are you commissioned to do in this role, and how are you having an impact on this issue?
So the Charlotte Lozier Institute is a think tank that was developed by Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America. So SBA is a lobbying group. We're a nonprofit. They recognized that there was a need for evidence-based arguments to support the pro-life position. Unfortunately, I'm sure your listeners are aware, academia is overwhelmingly pro-choice. In most of the articles, most of the peer-reviewed information is biased from a pro-abortion perspective. And so I'm just really blessed. I've been associated with Charlotte Lozier for probably about 4 years as an associate scholar. We're a very lean organization. We don't have a lot of full-time employees, but what we do is we tap people who are experts in their fields, neonatologists, obstetricians, bioethicists, whatever the need is to have good information available, we communicate with people that we know can address those issues in a very professional fashion.
So you're speaking to the issues of the day within the public square, doing the research, doing the thinking, and putting this in imagine into papers, and I think you present in front of legislators and committees and present these points of view. Now we're in a unique place, as we all know. We've 50 years of Roe versus Wade, and now Dobbs has come into play, and it has surprised, I think, a lot of people. Well, let me ask you this in terms of where we're at now. Where are we now on this issue of life and abortion?
You know, it has been interesting to see this all play out. I think if you're, maybe to back up for a minute to help your audience understand where we've come from. So prior to Roe, a lot of people don't realize it, but there were states that had legal abortion. New York, California, Colorado. What Roe did was, this was the Supreme Court deciding for social reasons and to some extent for eugenic reasons that they wanted abortion to be legal. And this was backed up by the professional medical organizations that have been progressive for years and years. So they put this forward. Roe did many things. It did not allow any restrictions at all in the first trimester. It only allowed a restriction in the second trimester if it was to benefit the safety for the woman. And in the third trimester, only then could restrictions be put in place. But a companion case that same day, Doe versus Bolton, said that all restrictions had to allow an abortion if it would benefit the life or health of the mother. Life is obviously self-explanatory, but health was basically defined as well-being. So emotional, financial, age, you name it, any of those could be used as an excuse to do an abortion. So essentially for almost 50 years, states have tried to put restrictions in place, and every time there's an immediate lawsuit and they've been struck down as unconstitutional. So Dobbs was crucial and to many people unexpected. In that case, it was a Mississippi 15-week ban. In that case, it was pointed out that it was very reasonable to limit abortion at that point. The United States is an outlier. We're one of only 7 countries in the world that will allow an elective abortion after a baby has reached viability.
Wow.
I mean, most of the European countries limit it by 12 to 15 weeks. So Dobbs was a unique case because it was very, very reasonable. And yet it violated Roe. And so when the Supreme Court, interestingly, by a 6-3 vote, they voted to uphold the Mississippi law, but only by a 5-4 vote did they vote to overturn Roe because Justice Roberts likes to walk a middle line. So what that did not make abortion illegal anywhere, but it just allowed the decision to return to the legislature.
Right.
The states immediately got on it, but I think we're seeing an effort for a federal legislation too. So it's not necessarily that it's only a state issue, but just that it's the people's elective representatives who should be making this decision and not judges who are unelected. And since that time, approximately half of the states have put restrictions in place. Many of them are heartbeat bans, some of them are total bans. So that's the world we're living in now, that many of these states are trying to implement these restrictions.
Yeah, I know with our team here at CMDA, as they press into this issue, it's become it's exponentially become more challenging. Only so far that now we're dealing with 50 plus of these conversations across the U.S. and dealing with different public policy issues at a state level, which I do agree with you is where it needs to be put into the hands of those that are elected by our citizens rather than a judicial fiat.
Stay with us. More Student Pulse podcast in just a moment.
Medical missionaries in particular have specific challenges and kind of difficulties we face on the mission field. So I think it's incredibly helpful to be able to have to meet the people who have gone through some of the struggles that we'll be going through and have access to the resources that they provide to prepare us as best as we could for the mission field.
I think it's very important to promote the work of CAHM because for those of us that really want to follow the call to make disciples through healthcare, we frequently encounter situations that take more wisdom and take a broad network of support to navigate. Whether these are ethical situations, personally devastating or challenging situations, and many of them are not things we imagined before we're in them. And so having a specific group focused on our own needs to help keep us in our area of ministry, I think is critical.
We're learning a lot. I know that some of the elective outcomes like propositions and other kinds of things that have been voted on have not gone the way that pro-life individuals would have hoped. And so it's been challenging, has it not? A mixed bag a bit.
It's been challenging, and I think a lot of the challenge is that the American people do not understand the issue.
Okay.
And that's why it's so important, the work that you're doing, the work
Yeah.
that I'm doing, to help people understand. Of course, one of the things that I'm sure all of your viewers have seen is immediate misinformation about what doctors can do to care for patients. The reality is, elective abortion, ending a human life for social or financial reasons, is really not, it's very hard to justify that. And so what they're doing instead is they're making people fear the law by thinking that it will harm women. And this is just not so. Every one of the laws, at Lozier, we've looked at the wording on every law. Every law allows an exception and allows an abortion if it is needed to protect the life of the mother or to prevent severe irreversible organ damage. And it allows the doctor to use his reasonable medical judgment. So essentially, he can follow the standard of care. None of the laws say it has to be an immediate risk. So if a woman has a severe heart defect and presents with a pregnancy early on, she may not be sick then, but we know that if it's a very severe problem, she may be very sick by the end of the pregnancy. So all of the laws allow the doctor to intervene at the time of diagnosis. And unfortunately, part of the problem is that, again, most of the mainstream medical organizations are very pro-abortion. The American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists is my professional organization, ACOG, and they have wonderful evidence-based recommendations, practice bulletins, committees' opinions, to help doctors know how to practice their profession. And if you look at these, you will see if this is going on, they say that you can intervene by separating the mother from her baby. Now, that can happen in various ways. It could happen as an abortion, but most of the time, these really serious situations happen in the second half of pregnancy, when a baby often can survive separated from his mother. So again, it doesn't have to be a D&E dismemberment abortion, which is the procedure that you would do at that time. It can be a medically indicated induction or perhaps C-section. And it's a much more caring way to care for the baby if you can. If he can't survive, perinatal hospice allows him to be comfortable and his family to hold him and grieve him appropriately. But nonetheless, going back to the laws, they do allow doctors to do what they need to do. But organizations like ACOG, despite having given us the recommendations in other formats, have been silent and have opposed the laws, but have not reminded doctors, by the way, we already told you when it's appropriate to intervene. So it's a very frustrating situation because women are, you've seen the articles, women are being hurt because they're not being managed appropriately.
No, I think what you're doing is, effective in addressing head on the myths and the misunderstandings, the misinformation which is out there, and giving people the right information so they understand the issue clearly. But it's again, it's a long slog. It's going to take much prayer, much effort. Someone said this is not the end of the issue. It's the beginning of the end. It's we're moving into another place, another phase in this. But would you speak, Ingrid, into how this issue perhaps has even gotten more complicated with the issue of chemical abortion? Because now that's front and center. And would you just speak into that a little bit and some of the unique challenges and how this is changing the issue for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage your listeners, the medical students, as they're looking at the profession that they want to choose, even if they're not going to be an obstetrician, this will impact them because there is quite a bit of pressure for internal medicine, for family practice, even for pediatricians to prescribe chemical abortion. And as we'll discuss, the FDA is removing all the supervision that will allow that to happen. But to start at the beginning, chemical abortion is provided by two medications. Mifepristone blocks progesterone receptors, and so it cuts off the hormonal support and causes the embryo or the fetus to die. And about 24 to 48 hours later, misoprostol is given, which essentially induces labor. So it causes the uterus to express the tissue that's there. The FDA over time has just progressively taken away any kind of supervision. In 2016, under Obama, they increased the gestational age from 7 to 10 weeks, even though at 10 weeks it fails quite frequently. They said, you know what, we don't even care to hear about any complications unless the woman dies. They did various other things at that time. Currently under the Biden administration, last year, using the COVID pandemic as an excuse, they removed what had previously been in-person restrictions. So before, the doctor had to be in the room with the woman, looking her in the eye, making sure that she wanted the abortion, that it wasn't someone else who was coercing her. They needed to do a physical examination. They needed to do an ultrasound, determine the gestational age, because many times women are mistaken about how far along in the pregnancy they are. Make sure it's in the uterus. Make sure it's not in a fallopian tube, because mifepristone does not work on a tubal pregnancy. It will continue to grow. It may rupture, and women have died undergoing abortions when this was not diagnosed. They need to determine their RH status. Does the woman need a ROGAM shot to prevent future pregnancy complications? None of those things need to happen anymore because of the FDA's decision last December. And unfortunately, just within the last week or so, the FDA made a new decision to allow it to be distributed through pharmacies.
That's right.
So again, this allows it to be prescribed by telemedicine, but even worse, it allows a woman to get online and to order it from an international distributor with no doctor involved, not even remotely, delivered to her mailbox, and then to be taken maybe a month later. You know, you just don't know what the scenarios are going to be. You know, does her coercive boyfriend who doesn't want a child order it and give it to her either secretly or force her to take it when no one is there to protect her? All of these things are starting to happen. Complications, just very briefly, when you look at the data, most of it comes from the abortion industry. They ignore the fact that many women with complications do not return to them. So they will typically have 15, 20% or more lost to follow-up. And for the purposes of their studies, they assume those were uncomplicated abortions. But as the doctor who sees the women in the emergency room, I can tell you many of those are complicated. When we look at good records linkage studies internationally where they actually care to have good data, it looks like about 3 to 8% of the time the woman has a hemorrhage or infection or retained fetal tissue and needs surgery. And of course, with this being removed from the realm of medical supervision, all of these things are going to get worse.
Well, thanks for laying out some of the challenges, certainly, and understanding of what's at stake, and, of course, clearing up some myths and misunderstandings. I'd like to turn the corner a bit on our conversation because being a student podcast as it is and being our audience is mostly students, I'd like for you to have an opportunity now to speak to some of the students who are listening. By the way, you should have a unique interest, I would think, in medical students. I hear your son is a M1, is he not?
He is. And yes, I absolutely have a heart for your audience. It doesn't seem that long ago that I was in medical school, but apparently it was. But going through it with my son has just been a blessed experience. And just as I'm sure your students listening, I've had the same conversation with Eli. What is going to happen? Do doctors of conscience, are we going to be able to get through the training? Are we going to be able to practice the way that we want to? And the answer is doctors have got to stand up for their rights. That right has not been taken away from us yet. But if we are fearful and if we were quiet and if we don't insist that we want to practice Hippocratic medicine, then perhaps at some point that will happen. But the good news is we're not there. Doctors can still practice according to the way that they want to practice. Now, of course, sometimes in medical school and perhaps residency, there may be times that it's wise not to take a stand. But there will be time, and I think that if we pray and follow the Spirit, that we'll know when it is a time to take a stand.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad that ethical providers are still going into medicine. It is absolutely necessary.
Yes, and we've had multiple conversations. I say we, my staff and I, on this issue because so many times students will contact us saying how they've been challenged. Their faith has been challenged, their ethical convictions have been challenged on this issue or the sexual orientation, gender identity issue. There's a whole host of things that have challenged them. And what we've been finding out oftentimes that the legal protections are often there. It's misinformation by others who insist that somehow they need to either remove themselves or be silent when in fact they need not have to do that. But it does take unique courage and a courage of a Daniel in these days to often step up and step into these situations.
Stay with us. More Student Pulse podcast in just a moment. To learn more about CMDA, download our CMDA Student Life app, available for Android and iPhone. The app will give you access to CMDA events, tools, Bible studies, and a wealth of other resources. Also, joining CMDA can be done on the app, and it only takes about 3 minutes to complete. As a student, CMDA will underwrite your membership so that you can join the community at no cost. Download the app today.
Let me ask you about medical students that would like to contribute or influence the pro-life conversation right now. Ingrid, what would you say to them? How can they speak in and influence this conversation right now, maybe in their on their campus, in their conversations with fellow medical students?
Well, I think the very first aspect is knowledge. Really understanding the issues. And, as you've mentioned, I work for the Charlotte Lozier Institute, Lozier.org. The American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists is AAPLOG.com. And even if you're not going to go into obstetrics, you can find good statements there helping to explain the medical issues related to abortion. So the students who can explain this to their peers, perhaps even to their fellow physicians, this is very, very helpful to have that knowledge. They should have very good knowledge about how to evaluate studies. As I mentioned, the abortion industry is throwing out studies. The journalists don't really understand it all, so they very obligingly will promote these studies. As an example, recently there was an article that said that maternal mortality was higher because of the pro-abortion laws, the pro-life laws. But as I told you, those laws just went into effect this year. Maternal mortality there's a lag. So looking at data from 2017 to 2019, they tried to make the case that these recent laws caused women to die. Obviously that's a very, easy thing to spot if you're well trained. I think that students, and of course CMDA has quite a bit of information, I know. APLOG likes to give students scholarship to their educational convention every year. So if you're interested in being with other students who think like you, look at their website and attend that conference. Start or join a pro-life group in your own school. I'm getting ready to do a round of some schools in Texas, so maybe some of your listeners will get a chance to hear me when I go around. But these groups, again, can encourage each other, and just I think that's crucially important. If you feel like you're the only one, it's much harder to step up and to speak out.
Let me emphasize, all those are great resources, Ingrid, and I'd say you're right. CMDA has some great position and policy statements on the issue of abortion, personhood, all kinds of things that are relevant, more than perhaps one person could read. There's almost 90 or so of these statements, and they're well done by our ethics committee. They're very well vetted, very well thought through, and are available on our website. And the things that you mentioned and that we'll try to link into our show notes and elsewhere so people have access to that. I do want to go back. I know this is some ground that we've touched briefly, but I'd like to go back to this idea of a Christian student, because this I've been told that these are real conversations that happen. Many of our healthcare professionals, or as they're mentoring students and they're talking to students, these are the concerns that they have. They're saying, I'm a pro-life student. I'd like to consider being an OBGYN as a specialty, but they're worried. They're worried, will I be forced to perform an abortion in my residency? Am I going to be, am I going to have to violate my conscience? Can you speak into that? Just maybe deal with whatever those fears or concerns are, or how would you challenge a student that may come to you with that concern or question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked, because there is absolutely a need for passionate pro-life students to go into obstetrics. And I'll give a little just advice, if I may, at looking at residency programs.
Yes.
There are programs that are called abortion opt-in and abortion opt-out training. And so as I went to a program that was opt-in, so you don't have to do training unless they'll give you the option to train, maybe a local Planned Parenthood, and you can opt into doing that training. So that's the most preferable way to go, because you have to make a decision to provide abortions.
Right.
Opt-out is the opposite. They're going to assume that you're going to train to provide abortions, but if you want to opt out, you can. So they're not legally required to make you do it, but I think we all recognize there will be this pressure, right? They're not going to hold a gun to your head, but it's much more difficult to get out of doing abortions if you're in an opt-out program. But nonetheless, if you're strong, you can do that. But typically, you'll have to take on other responsibilities. There may be a little friction with your fellow residents that they think they're doing more work because you're not doing this work. But there are some programs that you should look out for. There are programs that advertise themselves as Ryan training programs, RYAN.
Okay.
That is a very pro-abortion funding that came from University of California, San Francisco, Warren Buffett, to train abortion providers. So if you're looking at a program that says it's affiliated with Ryan, that's going to be one that's really going to pressure you to do abortions. I would recommend go to a state that now has abortion restrictions in place. In Texas, they're currently sending residents to New Mexico to train, but that's actually illegal. They can't use state funds to train for abortion. So I think states are going to tighten up on this as soon as they recognize what's happening. And so if you're in a state with abortion restrictions, very likely you're not going to be asked to do abortions because there aren't going to be any abortions to be done. So those are just all some useful things to know. But this is very important. Polls tell us that only 7 to 14% of practicing OBGYNs will perform an abortion if their patient requests it. So even though the students, of course, in an academic setting are probably led to believe that all obstetricians are pro-choice, the reality on the ground is nearly 90% of us are not doing abortions. So if you can get through your residency program, you can practice the way that you want to on the other side. Like I say, it's unfortunate that there's so much pressure on mifepristone. I am a little concerned about that there will be pressure on doctors to prescribe it, but you can always say no. I mean, we still live in a country where we can say no to things that violate our conscience.
Well, I also know that it's putting the feet to the fire on our Christian pharmacists now. They're gonna, they're also on the front lines of that issue. And so, I think to the point that, whether it be, the life issue, abortion, the SOGI issues, people in medicine, even dentistry, any kind of healthcare profession are going to be faced with ethical challenges, no matter where they happen to be. It almost becomes inescapable. I did want to circle back, though, to some of the things you mentioned, which were very helpful, Ingrid. I really appreciate the things to kind of keep an eye out for residencies. Are most of those fairly transparent? Are they easy to find, like an opt-in, opt-out? Is that easy to unearth those kinds of things, or does it take a little research to figure those things out?
It may take a little research. When I was on the board at APLOG, we tried to come up with a comprehensive list, and it was very difficult to do. Although as students go through this process and discover things, by all means, reach out to APLOG so we can begin putting together a list just to help people know, don't waste your time with that program.
All right. Very good. Well, Ingrid, we've covered a lot here, and we could go deeper yet still. There's so much to talk about. So maybe a couple things as we close our time. First of all, are there any resources? I know you mentioned several, and those are all good. Or anything else that might help a student who wants to press in on the pro-life arguments be better, have better some research and be better informed, I should say, to these issues? Is there any place that you'd recommend a student to go? And then just in closing, is there anything you'd say to students, just encouraging them as they walk this journey, especially in these days that the cultural winds are becoming, the storm clouds are afoot. I mean, there's a lot of challenges. There's strong headwinds that students are facing ethically. So what would you say to them?
Well, in terms of the education, like I mentioned, the places that we discussed, it's good to be able to have the complete pro-life argument, and there's some amazing books that have been written that I'm sure they can easily discover to help them, But the reality is that there are people who will readily admit this is a living human being, and they still say it's okay to kill it. So just making the point that this is human life is not enough. So as physicians, and most of the arguments in favor of abortion are that it will improve the life of the mother, right? So as much as we can make an argument for example, a woman is 6 times as likely to commit suicide in the year after an abortion than after childbirth. So the more we can make arguments like that and say, it's not good for women, and we could do another podcast where I outline all the reasons it's not good for women, but that information is available. But to be able to make that argument, I think is crucial. It's terrible for the baby that it kills, but it also harms that woman. And so that, I'm hoping, is the way that we move forward, change hearts and minds. You asked me to give encouragement to the students, and I just, I've been blessed to have this career. I love it. I'm passionate about it. There are many great careers, but this one just is the full package. I mean, we are dealing with people in life and death situations. And again, we need to have doctors who practice a 2-patient paradigm, that the woman and the baby are both of their patients. They both deserve their love, their respect, their protection. And I'm not discouraged. It is a weird world, and there are storm clouds, as you say, but we know that we're on the right side, and it's worth fighting for.
Amen. Well, thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Dr. Ingrid Skop, for being a part of this conversation and being able to share your, not just the information, but I think what really becomes important and what comes through our time together is that students are able to see someone like yourself who is a lover of Jesus, who's a Christ follower, who wants to walk faithfully with Christ and is living that out within the medical profession in the specialty that you are. And I think that's an incredible encouragement to the students that will have a chance to watch or listen to this podcast. So thank you again, Ingrid.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Okay, God bless.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. CMDA's Student Pulse podcast is a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the organisation. CMDA is non-partisan and does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on Student Pulse podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members.